At 6 a.m., the HOA president stormed my porch with sheriff's deputies, waving a demolition order for my hand-built cabin. This suburban dictator thought she could bully a widower into giving up. But she didn't know my property sits on federal forest land. What happened next destroyed her reputation across 3 counties. The mountain air bit at 15 degrees as Delilah Cromwell jabbed her manicured finger at court papers, that Karen haircut practically quivering with fake authority. Radio static from patrol cars mixed with the scent of pine resin and wood smoke from my chimney. She'd spent months terrorizing neighbors with bogus violations and threats. Big mistake picking on this retired Air Force logistics officer. I took a slow sip of coffee and pulled out my federal documents. Before you embarrass yourself further, you might want to see who actually owns this land. Her confident smirk melted like snow in July. What would you do if your HOA tried to demolish your dream home? Drop your state, let's expose where these neighborhood tyrants are running wild. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My name's Jake Blackwood, and 3 years ago, I lost my wife Sarah to cancer. We'd always dreamed of building a cabin in the Colorado mountains where her grandfather used to take us hiking. After the funeral, I couldn't stand staying in our suburban house with all those memories, so I finally made that dream happen. I inherited 2 acres from my own grandfather. Remote, beautiful land at 8,500 feet elevation, surrounded by towering pines and absolute silence. The kind of place where you can actually hear your own thoughts without some neighbor's leaf blower drowning them out. As a retired Air Force logistics officer, I knew how to follow rules, so I spent months getting every permit, survey, and approval stamp the county required. Built that cabin with my own hands as grief therapy, board by board, nail by nail. The structure's modest, 1,200 square feet with a metal roof, solar panels, and a composting toilet system that would make an environmental engineer weep with joy. My German Shepherd mix Ranger and I live peacefully up there, chopping wood, reading books, and slowly healing from the worst chapter of our lives. Then along came Linda Cromwell, like a suburban plague in designer boots. She moved to our area 18 months ago from Denver, driving a white Escalade with realtor vanity plates that somehow always stayed spotless despite our dirt roads. You know the type, the kind of person who probably Windexes her car daily and considers anything built before 2010 a tear-down opportunity. Within weeks, she'd elbowed her way onto the HOA board and immediately began improving community standards. I'm talking about a woman who measures grass height with an actual ruler and takes photos of trash cans left out past pickup day like she's documenting war crimes. The smell of her expensive perfume would hit you before she did. Always overdressed for mountain living in stiletto boots that clicked against stone pathways like a metronome of annoyance. Her blonde highlights were always perfectly maintained, requiring bi-weekly trips to some fancy Denver salon that probably charged more than most people's mortgage payments. Linda targeted me because my rustic lifestyle supposedly hurt property values. Never mind that my nearest neighbor lived 300 yards away through thick forest. She'd drive up unannounced with her clipboard and camera, documenting everything from my firewood stack to Ranger's water bowl like she was building a case for the United Nations. The first confrontation happened on a crisp October morning, when aspen leaves crunched underfoot and wood smoke drifted from chimneys across the valley. She marched up wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my truck, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Mr. Blackwood, your structure violates multiple HOA architectural standards," she announced, snapping photos of my solar panels like they were some kind of environmental terrorism. I pointed out the obvious. "Ma'am, I never signed any HOA documents. This property's been in my family since 1987. Her laugh could have stripped paint. "All properties in this subdivision are grandfathered into the association. You'll need to submit architectural review applications and pay the associated fees." "How much are we talking about?" $500 for the initial review, then whatever compliance costs are necessary." She gestured dismissively at my rain collection barrels. "Those eyesores will definitely have to go." That's when I learned she'd been conducting a whisper campaign, telling neighbors I was a problem resident who refused to maintain community standards. Several folks who used to wave when I drove past now suddenly found their driveways fascinating whenever I appeared. That evening, I spread my grandfather's original property deed across my kitchen table under lamplight, comparing it to Linda's HOA boundary maps. The rough texture of those yellowed documents felt like holding pieces of family history, back when neighbors actually talked to each other instead of measuring compliance violations. Something was seriously wrong with these boundaries. My grandfather's iron survey markers were still standing exactly where they'd been driven decades ago. but according to Linda's territorial claims, those markers should have been 50 feet south. I called the county recorder's office the next morning. Bob, the county clerk who'd been there since forever, confirmed my suspicions. "There's been a mapping discrepancy on your plot for years, son. Just never had reason to dig into it." That conversation planted a seed that would eventually grow into Linda's worst nightmare. 2 weeks later, Linda cranked up the pressure like she was trying to extract oil from my property. A certified letter arrived with my morning coffee, thick as a small-town phone book and about as welcome as a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag. The letter demanded a $500 architectural review fee for my non-compliant structure, plus daily $50 fines until my cabin was brought into community standards. She'd included color photos of my solar panels, composting toilet, and rain collection system like they were evidence of some environmental felony. The woman had even photographed Ranger's doghouse, for crying out loud. But here's where Linda made her first tactical error. She'd copied the letter to the county building department and sheriff's office, trying to get government backing for her little power trip. Time for my first counterpunch. I drove down to the county office that afternoon, carrying a manila folder stuffed with documentation. The building department's waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and bureaucratic defeat, with fluorescent lights humming overhead like dying insects. Bob, the county clerk, looked up from his paperwork with the expression of a man who'd seen every property dispute imaginable. "Bob, I need copies of all my building permits and approval letters," I said, sliding the HOA letter across his desk. He read it, chuckling like he'd just heard a good joke. "Son, this lady's got about as much authority over county-approved structures as my neighbor's cat has over NASA missions." Bob pulled my file. Every permit stamped and approved, every inspection passed with flying colors. During my military days, I'd learned that in Colorado, HOAs have to follow specific procedural rules when imposing fines or architectural requirements. Skip the steps or lack proper authority, and their actions become legally worthless. Linda was about to discover that lesson the hard way. We made copies of everything, including a letter from the county confirming that no HOA approval was required for my construction project. I mailed my response the same day, but didn't stop there. A little research revealed something delicious about Linda's precious HOA. Turns out their corporate registration had lapsed 6 months ago. The state business database showed inactive status in bold red letters. Kind of hard to enforce rules when you're not even a real organization anymore. Linda's response came faster than a Denver traffic ticket. She doubled down with threats of emergency enforcement action and immediate safety violations. The woman was like a gambler who keeps betting after losing her car keys, completely convinced the next hand would save her. That's when she escalated to what I call her nuclear option, filing a noise complaint with the sheriff's department about my generator disturbing the neighborhood. Never mind that my nearest neighbor lived 300 yards away through thick forest. Deputy Martinez showed up at my door on a Thursday evening looking about as comfortable as a vegan at a barbecue competition. The sound of his patrol car crunching up my gravel driveway brought Ranger to attention. Though my dog's tail was wagging, he could sense this wasn't a hostile visit. "Mr. Blackwood, I got a noise complaint about generator disturbance," Martinez said, clearly embarrassed. "Lady says you're running equipment all hours, disturbing the neighborhood." I gestured toward the empty landscape around us. "Deputy, my nearest neighbor is Roy Patterson, and he's 300 yards through those trees. Want to walk over and ask if my generator's keeping him awake?" Martinez looked around at the vast wilderness, then back at his paperwork. The evening air carried the scent of pine resin and the distant sound of an owl calling across the valley. "Sir, I'm required to respond to all complaints, but honestly, this seems like a civil matter." "About that," I said, pulling out my phone, "would you like to see the state business registry showing this HOA doesn't actually exist anymore?" The deputy's eyebrows shot up like 4th of July fireworks. That was my mini twist moment. Linda thought she was using law enforcement to pressure me, but instead she'd just educated a sheriff's deputy about her organization's illegal status. "Ma'am's been filing a lot of complaints lately," Martinez admitted. "We're starting to see a pattern here." After he left, I called my neighbor Roy, a Vietnam vet who'd been watching this whole drama unfold with increasing amusement. Roy's got that gravelly voice you only get from decades of unfiltered cigarettes and zero tolerance for nonsense. "Jake, that woman's been bothering the Patterson widow too," Roy told me over the phone. "Tried to fine old Mrs. Patterson for having too many bird feeders. Said they were attracting undesirable wildlife." The pieces were forming a clear picture. Linda wasn't just targeting me. She was systematically bullying anyone who didn't fit her suburban fantasy. The elderly, the veterans, Anyone living the mountain lifestyle she'd moved here to escape but somehow couldn't tolerate in others. I started documenting everything with military precision. Photos, emails, timestamps, witness statements. Superior firepower means nothing without proper intelligence and documentation. Linda was digging herself a hole, and I was about to hand her a bigger shovel. The next morning, she filed a formal lien against my property for unpaid assessments. Despite having zero legal authority, that piece of paper would eventually become federal evidence. Linda's next move proved she'd learned absolutely nothing from her first failure. Instead of backing down, she doubled down like a poker player with a terrible hand and an even worse attitude. She organized what she called a community safety meeting about my non-compliant structure, sending official-looking invitations to every household within a 2-mile radius. The woman even had the audacity to invite a county inspector under completely false pretenses, claiming there were urgent health and safety violations that required immediate attention. The meeting was scheduled for the community center on a Tuesday evening when the temperature had dropped to single digits and the smell of wood smoke hung thick in the mountain air. I showed up carrying a thick manila folder and wearing my best poker face, a skill I'd perfected during 20 years of military briefings where staying calm could mean the difference between mission success and becoming someone's cautionary tale. Linda had transformed the community center into her personal kangaroo court, complete with a projector showing blown-up photos of my cabin from every conceivable angle. She'd even created a PowerPoint presentation titled Maintaining Community Standards in Mountain Living, because apparently nothing says mountain living like a suburban realtor with a laptop and delusions of authority. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps while folding chairs scraped against linoleum as neighbors filed in, their winter boots leaving puddles of melted snow that smelled like wet wool and regret. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda began, clicking her laser pointer like she was prosecuting war crimes. "We're here tonight because one resident refuses to comply with basic community standards that protect all our property values." That's when County Inspector Williams raised his hand, looking about as confused as a tourist trying to find Starbucks in downtown Leadville. "Ma'am, I was told there were immediate safety violations requiring emergency inspection. What exactly am I looking at here?" Linda's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of panic in her eyes. "Well, there are concerns about structural integrity and sanitation issues." I stood up slowly, the folder in my hands feeling as solid as my grandfather's old survey markers. "Inspector Williams, would you like to see the documentation showing my structure exceeds all county safety codes?" For the next 10 minutes, I methodically presented my case. Building permits, inspection reports, county approval letters, and photographs of every safety feature in my cabin. Williams examined each document with the thoroughness of a man who'd spent decades separating real problems from suburban hysteria. Back in my military logistics days, I'd learned that documentation beats accusations every single time, and patterns of harassment reveal more about the accuser than individual incidents ever could. I'd been keeping meticulous records of every interaction with Linda, every false claim, every attempt at intimidation, every power play disguised as community concern. "Mr. Blackwood," Inspector Williams said after reviewing everything, "your structure doesn't just meet code, it's basically a textbook example of how off-grid construction should be done. Solar backup systems, proper ventilation, emergency water storage. Hell, most suburban houses don't have safety features this comprehensive." The room fell silent except for the hum of those terrible fluorescent lights and the distant sound of wind rattling the community center's windows like it was trying to escape this bureaucratic nightmare. But here's where the evening took a deliciously interesting turn. While Linda was busy trying to salvage her credibility, I noticed something beautiful about the HOA documentation she'd been waving around. The official address listed for the association was identical to Linda's real estate office address. Talk about a conflict of interest so obvious it needed its own zip code. I'd done some homework before the meeting and discovered that Linda had used this exact same playbook on 3 other families in the past year. Elderly widow Mrs. Patterson, forced to remove her excessive bird feeders. The Johnson family, pressured to sell after bogus architectural violations. Roy's neighbor, harassed until he moved his perfectly legal RV. Every single case involved longtime residents who lived simply and didn't fit Linda's vision of suburban perfection. And in every case, Linda had magically appeared with potential buyers shortly after the harassment began. "Excuse me," I said, standing again. "Before we adjourn, I'd like the community to know about some interesting patterns I've discovered in HOA enforcement practices." Linda's face went white faster than fresh powder on a ski slope. "That's not relevant to tonight's discussion." Actually, it's completely relevant, I continued, pulling out a timeline I'd prepared. Mrs. Patterson harassed about bird feeders until she considered selling. The Johnsons forced out over fence height violations that turned out to be non-existent. The Hendersons threatened with daily fines until they moved their RV. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like water over stones. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a systematic campaign targeting anyone who didn't boost property values for Linda's real estate empire. The meeting effectively split the community down the middle, with longtime residents sharing stories of harassment while newer residents, mostly Linda's former clients, defended her improvements. You could taste the tension in that overheated room. As people filed out into the bitter night air, Linda made one last desperate play. She announced a special emergency assessment of $3,000 per household for infrastructure improvements, due within 30 days. I refused payment on the spot, citing the HOA's lapsed registration. The next morning, Linda filed an official lien against my property. That fraudulent lien would eventually become federal evidence. But Linda was too busy digging to notice she'd hit bedrock. Linda's final pre-Christmas gift to me arrived on December 23rd, delivered by a private process server who looked like he'd rather be wrestling bears than trudging through knee-deep snow in a cheap suit. The guy carried what Linda called an emergency demolition notice, with all the enthusiasm of a man delivering his own death warrant. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm required to serve you with this document," he said, his breath creating clouds in the frigid morning air that smelled like pine needles and impending legal disaster. "Ma'am says the structure comes down Christmas Eve for health and safety violations." Behind him sat 2 sheriff's patrol cars, engines running, exhaust pipes puffing white smoke into the crystal-clear mountain air. Linda had somehow convinced Deputies Martinez and Thompson to provide enforcement support for what she was calling an emergency action under the HOA's health and safety provisions. Because nothing says Christmas spirit like trying to make a widower homeless on December 24th. I accepted the papers while Ranger growled low in his throat. My dog's always been an excellent judge of character. The demolition notice was impressive in its complete lack of legal authority, demanding I tear down my cabin within 24 hours or face immediate enforcement action by county authorities. "Gentlemen," I said to the deputies, pulling out my phone and hitting record, "before we proceed, I want to make sure everyone understands the legal situation here." Martinez shifted uncomfortably, his radio crackling with dispatch calls about actual crimes happening elsewhere in the county. "Sir, we're just here for civil standby. This is between you and your HOA. Back in my Air Force days, I'd learned that sheriff's deputies can only enforce court orders from actual judges, not private demands from neighborhood tyrants pretending to have authority." Linda was about to get a free education in the difference between real law enforcement and her personal vendetta squad. "Deputies, are you aware that you have no jurisdiction over private HOA disputes?" I asked calmly. "You can only enforce actual court orders signed by judges." Thompson looked at his paperwork, then at Linda, then back at me with growing confusion. "Ma'am told us this was a court-ordered demolition." I handed him the county building department letter confirming my structure was completely legal. "This isn't a court order, deputy. It's a private demand letter with about as much legal authority as my grocery shopping list." That's when Linda made her biggest tactical error yet. Seeing her carefully orchestrated drama falling apart, she stepped forward and launched into a vicious personal attack, bringing up Sarah's death and suggesting I was mentally unstable from grief and clearly unable to maintain civilized standards. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Even the wind through the pine trees went quiet, like nature itself was offended by her cruelty. The deputy's attitudes shifted instantly. Martinez's jaw tightened, and Thompson actually took a step back from Linda. Even in small mountain communities, law enforcement officers know the difference between legitimate complaints and pure malice dressed up as civic duty. "Ma'am," Martinez said with the kind of controlled politeness that signals someone has just crossed a very serious line, "we're going to need you to step back and let us handle this professionally." Several neighbors had come out to watch the spectacle, drawn by the unusual sight of multiple patrol cars on our quiet mountain road. I could see Mrs. Patterson peeking through her curtains, probably wondering if Linda was about to target her bird feeders next. That's when I decided to launch my own mini counterattack. Time to plant the seed that would grow into Linda's worst nightmare. "You know," I said conversationally, taking a slow sip of coffee that tasted like victory and mountain spring water, "I've been doing some fascinating research about property boundaries lately. Found some old federal survey markers on my land that tell quite an interesting story." Linda's eyes narrowed like a predator spotting wounded prey. "What kind of survey markers?" The kind that might make you want to double-check your legal authority before proceeding with any demolition plans, I replied. Amazing what you can discover when you actually research land ownership instead of just assuming you have power over other people's property. I could see the uncertainty creeping into her expression like frost forming on glass. She'd been so confident in her suburban power play that she'd never bothered to verify the basic facts about the property she was trying to control. Martinez and Thompson exchanged glances that said they were starting to wonder what kind of legal quicksand they'd stepped into. The original complaint about emergency violations was looking more like systematic harassment every minute. "Mr. Blackwood," Martinez said carefully, "we're going to need to see actual evidence of violations before we can take any enforcement action. Ma'am, do you have documentation from county inspectors supporting these emergency claims?" Linda sputtered something about obvious violations and community standards, but couldn't produce a single official document supporting her demands. Meanwhile, I had a folder full of county approvals thicker than a Denver phone book. The deputies left without taking any action, but not before Martinez quietly suggested that Linda might want to consult with a lawyer before filing any more complaints. The process server practically sprinted back to his car through the snow. As Linda drove away in her pristine Escalade, I could see her making frantic phone calls through the windshield. Those federal survey markers were about to ruin her entire world. Christmas Day gave me the perfect excuse to do some serious hiking and detective work. While Linda was probably spending the holiday plotting her next suburban assault, I strapped on snowshoes and headed deep into the forest behind my cabin, following a trail my grandfather had shown me decades ago when I was just a kid who thought adults always knew what they were doing. The mountain air was so crisp it made your lungs ache in the best possible way, and fresh snow crunched under my feet like nature's own bubble wrap. Ranger bounded ahead, his black fur stark against the white landscape, occasionally stopping to investigate scents that probably included last night's deer visitors and this morning's rabbit highway. About half a mile up the slope, I found what I was looking for, the original federal survey markers my grandfather had mentioned in his old stories. These weren't the newer county markers that defined private property boundaries. These were the real McCoy, heavy iron posts stamped with U.S. Forest Service 1,923 inches and GPS coordinates that were about to make Linda's year considerably worse. I pulled out my phone and cross-referenced the coordinates with modern mapping apps. What I discovered made my coffee taste even better than usual, and my grandfather's old stories suddenly make perfect sense. My entire 2-acre plot, every square foot of my cabin, solar panels, and Ranger's favorite stick-chasing area, sat completely within the boundaries of Arapahoe National Forest. According to federal records that had never been properly updated, my property had never actually been transferred from government ownership to private hands. The 1987 subdivision that created our neighborhood had included my grandfather's land by mistake. Some bureaucrat with obviously excellent attention to detail had drawn boundary lines on a map without bothering to check federal ownership records. My grandfather had been paying property taxes on land that technically belonged to Uncle Sam, and the county had been happily cashing those checks for decades without asking awkward questions. Back in my military days, I'd learned about something called the Supremacy Clause, a constitutional principle that makes federal law trump all local regulations like a royal flush beats a pair of twos. When federal and local laws conflict, federal authority wins every single time. No exceptions, no negotiations, no suburban HOA power trips allowed. Linda's threats, fines, liens, and demolition orders weren't just legally worthless. They were attempts to exercise authority over federal property. That's like trying to issue parking tickets in Yellowstone National Park and expecting the rangers to enforce them with a straight face. I spent the rest of Christmas afternoon working my way through federal bureaucracy, which moves about as fast as mountain erosion but eventually gets results. The Forest Service representative I finally reached sounded like she was trying not to laugh when I explained the situation. "Mr. Blackwood, if your property is indeed within federal boundaries, then no local HOA has any jurisdiction whatsoever. You'd be governed by federal land use regulations, which are considerably more lenient for existing structures than most suburban covenants." The implications hit me like an avalanche of pure, concentrated justice. Linda's entire campaign of harassment had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually owned what. Every threat, every fine, every attempt at intimidation had been directed at property she had absolutely no authority to control. Better yet, her fraudulent liens and false claims against federal property could constitute wire fraud, a federal crime that makes the FBI very interested in suburban tyrants who think they're above the law. Linda hadn't just picked a fight with the wrong veteran. She'd accidentally declared war on the United States government. I requested an expedited federal survey to confirm the boundaries, which they agreed to conduct after New Year's. The surveyor mentioned that once federal ownership was confirmed, all relevant parties would need to be notified, including anyone who had filed false claims against the property. That meant Linda would soon discover that her suburban empire had just crashed headfirst into federal authority at about 90 miles per hour. The woman who'd spent months trying to demolish my cabin was about to learn she'd been threatening to destroy government property. This was going to be fun. The week between Christmas and New Year's turned into the most productive planning session of my life, fueled by endless pots of coffee and the satisfying knowledge that Linda had accidentally picked a fight with the United States government. You don't just walk into a legal gunfight. You make sure you've got the biggest gun and know exactly when to pull the trigger. My first call was to Roy, my Vietnam vet neighbor who'd been watching this whole drama unfold, with the detached amusement of someone who'd faced real enemies armed with actual weapons instead of clipboards and attitude problems. The smell of his pipe tobacco drifted across the snowy distance between our properties as we talked strategy over coffee that could strip paint. "Jake, that woman's been terrorizing half the neighborhood," Roy told me, his gravelly voice carrying decades of no-nonsense wisdom. "Mrs. Patterson's scared to put out her bird feeders, and the Henderson family's talking about moving rather than deal with more harassment. Time somebody showed Linda what real consequences look like." Next, I contacted Katie Martinez, a reporter from the local newspaper who'd been covering HOA overreach stories across Colorado. Katie had that hungry look of a journalist who'd stumbled onto something bigger than routine suburban disputes, like a bloodhound catching the scent of a really good scandal. "Mr. Blackwood, if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be the biggest HOA scandal in state history," Katie said. I could practically hear her typing notes through the phone. "I'd like to be there when you make this revelation public." The real game changer came when I reached out to Bob at the county recorder's office. Turns out Bob had been quietly building his own file on Linda's activities, documenting every fraudulent lien and false claim she'd filed over the past year with the methodical patience of someone who'd been waiting for the right moment to strike back. "Son, I've been waiting for someone to challenge this woman properly," Bob confided over the phone. "She's been filing paperwork with about as much legal authority as my neighbor's golden retriever. Problem is, most folks don't know how to fight back against official-looking documents." Bob walked me through the research process that any property owner could use to protect themselves, knowledge I'd picked up during my military logistics training but refined through this experience. First, always order a professional property survey that includes historical boundary research. Most people assume their deed tells the whole story, but original survey markers often reveal discrepancies that can invalidate years of false claims, like finding out your neighborhood bully has been picking fights in someone else's backyard. Second, check your HOA's corporate registration status with the state. In Colorado, HOAs must maintain active corporate status to have legal authority, but about 30% have some kind of procedural violation that completely voids their power. They just hope nobody bothers to check the paperwork behind their intimidation tactics. Third, research federal land maps, especially in mountain areas where boundaries shift over time due to old surveying errors. The federal government maintains detailed ownership records that trump all local claims, but most people never think to check them until suburban tyrants start making threats. The Forest Service expedited my boundary survey, sending out a team that confirmed what Christmas Day had revealed. Every inch of my property sat within federal boundaries, making Linda's claims not just wrong, but potentially criminal. "Mr. Blackwood," the lead surveyor explained while showing me the official documentation, "when private entities file false claims against federal property, that crosses into wire fraud territory. The FBI gets very interested in people who think they can intimidate federal landowners." I spent the next few days building an airtight case file with military precision. Photos of every threatening letter, recordings of intimidating phone calls, documentation of fraudulent liens, witness statements from neighbors who'd been similarly harassed. The manila folders stacked up on my kitchen table like ammunition for a legal war. The psychological preparation was just as important as the legal strategy. This fight had become about more than my cabin. It was about standing up for everyone Linda had bullied, everyone who'd been too scared or confused to fight back against her suburban tyranny dressed up as community standards. I thought about Sarah, how she'd always despised bullies who picked on people unable to defend themselves. She would have loved watching Linda get her comeuppance from federal authorities. That cabin represented our shared dreams, built with my own hands and her endless encouragement. and no power-hungry realtor was going to destroy what we'd created together. Ranger seemed to sense something big was coming, positioning himself between me and the road whenever cars approached, like a furry early warning system trained to detect incoming suburban nonsense. Katie, the reporter, had been investigating Linda's real estate practices, discovering a pattern of harassment followed by convenient property sales. 3 families had sold their homes after sustained HOA pressure, with Linda's company handling each transaction and pocketing substantial commissions from her own manufactured crises. By New Year's Eve, everything was in place. Federal documentation, legal representation, media coverage, witness statements, and criminal referrals to federal investigators. Linda's next aggressive move would trigger the most spectacular public downfall in Colorado HOA history. She had no idea that her suburban empire was about to face an artillery barrage of federal authority, investigative journalism, and one very methodical veteran who'd finally run out of patience. Linda kicked off the new year like a woman who'd confused suburban HOA politics with actual warfare, apparently deciding that if legal intimidation wasn't working, it was time to escalate to behavior that would make a middle school bully cringe with embarrassment. Her first move was hiring what she generously called private security. 2 guys in a beat-up Ford pickup who parked at the end of my driveway and took photos of everyone who visited. The smell of their cheap cigarettes and gas station burritos drifted up through the crisp mountain air whenever the wind shifted, a constant reminder that Linda had completely lost her grip on appropriate responses to property disputes. These weren't trained security professionals. They looked more like unemployed construction workers she'd recruited from a dive bar after last call. One of them actually fell asleep in his truck during his surveillance shift, which really inspired confidence in Linda's tactical planning abilities. Roy called me on January 3rd, his gravelly voice tight with the kind of controlled anger that comes from watching bullies target defenseless people. "Jake, that woman's got her discount detectives taking pictures of Mrs. Patterson every time she checks her mailbox. 80-year-old widow shouldn't have to live in fear because some suburban princess thinks she's running the CIA." But Linda's harassment campaign went beyond just amateur surveillance. She'd launched a whisper campaign around town, spreading rumors that I was a dangerous, unstable veteran who posed a threat to community safety. The irony of a woman who'd never served a day in uniform questioning the mental health of someone who'd spent 20 years defending her right to be a petty tyrant wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. The rumor mill got ugly fast. Linda contacted local businesses, suggesting they refuse me service for community safety reasons. She even tried reaching out to veterans organizations, claiming I was giving former military members a bad name with my antisocial behavior. That last move was a tactical error that would have made my old drill sergeants laugh until they needed oxygen. Veterans stick together like superglue, especially when some civilian tries to attack one of their own with lies and manipulation tactics that wouldn't fool a reasonably intelligent house cat. On January 5th, Linda's desperation escalated to actual criminal behavior. I woke up to find my solar panels covered with bright orange spray paint, amateur vandalism that looked like the artistic efforts of middle schoolers having a rebellious weekend. The morning air carried the sharp chemical smell of fresh paint, and I could see boot prints in the snow leading back toward the road. They'd also placed fake, road-closed, hazardous conditions signs at the bottom of my access road, apparently believing that official-looking orange plastic could somehow prevent federal investigators from reaching federal property. The audacity was almost impressive. I documented everything with military precision, adding each incident to my growing evidence file that was becoming thick enough to use as a doorstop. Enemy actions often reveal their desperation, and Linda was clearly running out of legitimate options faster than a gambler running out of rent money. The moment that sealed Linda's fate came when she attempted to bribe County Inspector Williams, offering him what she called a consulting fee if he'd manufacture violations during a surprise inspection of my cabin. Williams, being an honest man who'd spent 30 years building his reputation, immediately reported the attempted bribery to his supervisor and the district attorney's office. "Mr. Blackwood," Williams told me during a phone call that I recorded with his permission, "I've seen a lot of property disputes in my career, but I've never had someone try to pay me to invent violations. That woman's crossed lines that decent people don't even know exist." This was my mini-twist moment. Linda thought she was escalating pressure on me, but she'd actually just committed a felony that gave prosecutors another charge to add to their growing list. Attempted bribery of a public official carries serious penalties, especially when it's part of a broader pattern of fraud and harassment. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my federal case with the patience of someone who knew the biggest legal hammer in American history was about to fall on Linda's perfectly styled head. The FBI's white-collar crime division had confirmed they were investigating her fraudulent liens against federal property, crimes that carry penalties serious enough to make suburban bullies suddenly very interested in plea bargains and community service. The Forest Service had completed their official boundary survey, confirming that every square inch of my property sat within federal jurisdiction. They'd also discovered that Linda's HOA had been collecting fees and issuing fines against federal land for over a year, creating a paper trail of attempted fraud that would make federal prosecutors smile like kids, finding extra presents on Christmas morning. But Linda wasn't finished with her desperate measures. On January 8th, she organized what she called an emergency community meeting to discuss my escalating threat to neighborhood safety, scheduling it for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. What she didn't know was that federal investigators, local media, and about half the county would be attending that meeting. Her public downfall was exactly 1 week away. Linda's emergency community meeting became the focal point for her final, desperate power play. She spent the week before January 15th orchestrating what she probably imagined would be my public trial and conviction, complete with character assassination and community banishment. Instead, she was unknowingly preparing her own professional funeral. The woman went full scorched earth in those final days, like a general who'd lost touch with reality and decided that if she couldn't win the war, she'd at least burn down everything in sight. She organized what she called a citizen documentation project, recruiting her most loyal HOA supporters to patrol my property in shifts and record everything I did. These suburban spies positioned themselves along the mountain road with cameras, notepads, and the kind of self-righteous determination usually reserved for people convinced they're saving civilization. They documented when I took out my trash, when Ranger went for walks, when I chopped firewood, apparently believing that normal human activities constituted evidence of some unnamed crimes. The smell of their car exhaust mixed with coffee and fast food created a permanent cloud of amateur surveillance that drifted through our formerly peaceful mountain community. Roy called it the most pathetic stakeout in law enforcement history, and he'd seen some genuinely pathetic operations during his military service. Linda's smear campaign reached new levels of creative desperation. She created fake social media accounts to spread rumors about my dangerous behavior, posted anonymous flyers around town questioning my mental stability, and even attempted to contact my former military commanders to suggest I was having episodes related to combat stress. That last move demonstrated just how little Linda understood about military culture. Veterans don't abandon their own based on civilian gossip, especially when that gossip comes from someone who thinks measuring grass height constitutes public service. But Linda's masterstroke of stupidity came when she decided to escalate beyond harassment into what federal prosecutors would later classify as attempted extortion. She sent me a final ultimatum on January 12th, delivered by certified mail with copies to the sheriff's department, county building office, and local newspaper. The letter demanded I voluntarily demolish my cabin within 72 hours or face coordinated enforcement action by all relevant authorities. She claimed to have evidence of federal violations and threatened to pursue maximum penalties unless I complied with her demands. The document was beautifully incriminating, a written confession that Linda was attempting to use false federal claims to coerce me into destroying my own property. Federal investigators later told me they'd rarely seen such clear evidence of extortion delivered so conveniently. Linda had also made the tactical error of copying Katie the reporter on her ultimatum, apparently believing that media attention would pressure me into submission. Instead, Katie immediately contacted me to verify that Linda was threatening federal prosecution over property she didn't control, creating a paper trail that would become front-page news. Meanwhile, I was putting the finishing touches on Linda's legal destruction with methodical precision. The FBI had confirmed that filing fraudulent liens against federal property constituted wire fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of government assets. Each false document Linda had filed carried potential penalties that could result in years of federal prison time. The Forest Service had prepared their official findings, confirming that my property had been federal land since 1923 and that no private entity had any authority to regulate activities within the boundaries. They'd also discovered that Linda's HOA had been operating without proper registration for 8 months, making every fine and fee they'd collected technically theft. Federal prosecutors had built what they called an exceptionally strong case against Linda, with evidence including recorded phone calls, fraudulent documents, witness statements, and her own written admissions of attempted extortion. They were particularly interested in her systematic targeting of vulnerable residents, and her use of false federal claims to intimidate people into compliance. I spent the weekend before the community meeting coordinating final details with my team of allies. Katie had prepared an investigative report that would expose Linda's entire operation. Roy had gathered statements from 6 other families who'd been harassed by Linda's tactics. Bob at the county office had documented every fraudulent filing and procedural violation. The community was buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread that something big was going to happen at Tuesday's meeting, though most people assumed it would be Linda finally succeeding in forcing me out of the neighborhood. Local businesses were taking bets on how long my trial would last. Linda spent Monday making final preparations for what she clearly expected to be her moment of triumph. She rented additional chairs for the community center, hired a professional photographer to document the proceedings, and even contacted a process server to be standing by in case immediate enforcement action became necessary. The woman had transformed a simple property dispute into a federal criminal case, complete with wire fraud charges, extortion evidence, and enough documented harassment to keep prosecutors busy for months. She'd systematically violated federal law while creating a perfect paper trail of her own criminal behavior. Tuesday evening couldn't come fast enough. Linda had spent months digging her own legal grave, and now she was about to discover that she'd been using federal property as her burial site. The final showdown was 12 hours away. Tuesday evening, January 15th, arrived with the kind of crisp mountain air that makes everything feel sharper, more real. The community center parking lot filled up faster than a Black Friday sale, with cars crunching over packed snow and exhaust clouds mixing with the scent of pine trees and anticipation. Linda had transformed the community center into her personal courtroom, complete with a podium, professional lighting, and a projection screen that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. She'd even hired what looked like a court reporter, apparently believing this suburban kangaroo trial would require official documentation. I arrived exactly on time, carrying a single manila folder and wearing the kind of calm expression that comes from knowing you're holding all the winning cards in a poker game where your opponent thinks they're playing checkers. The room was packed beyond capacity, standing room only, with folks spilling out into the hallway. Linda had gotten her wish for community attention, though probably not the kind she'd been hoping for. The air hummed with nervous energy and the low murmur of neighbors speculating about what was about to unfold. Linda stood at the podium wearing a navy blue suit that screamed, "Serious professional making serious accusations," her blonde hair perfectly styled and her makeup applied with the precision of someone preparing for television cameras. She'd positioned herself like a prosecutor addressing a jury, clearly savoring what she believed would be her moment of ultimate vindication. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda began, her voice carrying across the silent room with theatrical authority, "we're here tonight to address a situation that threatens the safety, security, and property values of our entire community." She clicked through her PowerPoint presentation, showing enlarged photos of my cabin from every conceivable angle, my solar panels, my composting system, even pictures of Ranger's water bowl. The woman had documented my property more thoroughly than a federal crime scene investigation. "This individual," she continued, gesturing toward me with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for courtroom dramas, "has repeatedly refused to comply with basic community standards. He's demonstrated hostile behavior toward legitimate authority and poses an ongoing threat to neighborhood stability." The crowd murmured approval from her supporters while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something wasn't quite right about this whole theatrical production. "Furthermore," Linda announced with obvious relish, "I have evidence that his structure violates federal regulations, and I'm prepared to pursue maximum penalties to protect this community." That was my cue. I stood slowly, the manila folder feeling solid in my hands, and walked toward the podium with the measured pace of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with actual authority figures rather than suburban pretenders. "Ma'am," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "before you embarrass yourself any further, you might want to see what the United States Forest Service has to say about your authority here." Linda's confident smirk faltered like a car engine running out of gas. "What are you talking about?" I opened my folder and pulled out the official federal survey documents, holding them up for the entire room to see. My property sits entirely within the boundaries of Arapahoe National Forest. It's been federal land since 1923. The silence in that room was so complete you could have heard a snowflake hit the ground outside. Linda's face went through several shades of white before settling on a color that reminded me of old cottage cheese. "That means," I continued, enjoying every second of her dawning horror, that you've been filing fraudulent liens against federal property, attempting to extort compliance with regulations you have no authority to enforce, and harassing a federal landowner for over 6 months. That's when FBI Special Agent Rodriguez and Forest Service Investigator Williams stepped forward from the back of the room, their badges visible and their expressions serious enough to make a tax auditor look cheerful. "Miss Cromwell," Agent Rodriguez announced, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, attempted extortion, and filing false claims against federal property." The room erupted like a dam bursting. Linda's supporters sat in stunned silence while longtime residents began applauding. Camera flashes went off as Katie, the reporter, documented Linda's perp walk through a crowd of neighbors who'd watched her terrorize their community for months. "This is impossible," Linda sputtered as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "I had legal authority. I was protecting property values." "Ma'am," Agent Rodriguez replied with professional courtesy, "you had about as much legal authority over federal land as you do over the Pentagon parking lot." As they led Linda out to the federal law enforcement vehicles waiting in the parking lot, I addressed the remaining crowd. "Folks, this was never about property standards or community safety. This was about a bully who thought she could intimidate people into submission. Federal law protects all of us from that kind of harassment." The applause that followed echoed through the mountain valley like thunder, carrying the sound of justice finally served and a community finally free from suburban tyranny. Linda's reign of HOA terror was officially over. The immediate aftermath of Linda's arrest felt like watching a dam burst in slow motion, except instead of water, it was months of pent-up neighborhood frustration finally flowing free. Within hours, her entire HOA empire collapsed faster than a house of cards in a tornado, leaving behind nothing but fraudulent paperwork and the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with legal disaster. Linda faced federal charges that would keep prosecutors busy for months: wire fraud, attempted extortion, filing false claims against government property, and conspiracy to defraud federal landowners. The FBI had built what they called an exceptionally solid case using Linda's own meticulously documented harassment campaign as evidence. Her obsessive attention to detail, once used to terrorize neighbors, now provided prosecutors with a roadmap to her conviction. The financial penalties alone were staggering enough to make a lottery winner wince. Every fraudulent lien had to be reversed, every illegal fee returned with interest, and the federal government demanded restitution for investigative costs. Linda's real estate license was revoked permanently, her business assets frozen, and multiple civil lawsuits from harassed families lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. But the real victory was watching our mountain community heal from months of artificial division, created by one woman's suburban power fantasy. Mrs. Patterson put her bird feeders back up, adding 3 new ones, just because I can. The Henderson family decided to stay after all, and their RV became a neighborhood gathering spot for impromptu barbecues and stargazing sessions under skies that somehow seemed clearer without Linda's toxic presence. Roy organized what he called the annual Freedom from HOA Tyranny Festival for the following 4th of July, complete with a booth where people could shred their HOA violation notices and roast marshmallows over the ceremonial fire. The event drew families from across Colorado who'd faced similar harassment, creating a support network that continues growing every year. Katie's investigative reporting won a state journalism award and sparked legislative hearings about HOA accountability. Her articles helped expose similar harassment operations in Denver suburbs, leading to criminal charges against 3 other HOA presidents who'd been running extortion schemes disguised as community improvement programs. The personal healing was just as important as the legal victory. Working through this fight had helped me process Sarah's death in ways that grief counseling never could. She would have absolutely loved seeing justice served to a bully who picked on vulnerable people, and I swear I could hear her laughing whenever I passed the spot where Linda's Escalade used to park. 6 months after Linda's arrest, I established the Mountain Veterans Legal Defense Fund, providing free legal assistance to veterans and elderly residents facing HOA harassment. The fund partners with civil rights organizations and veteran advocacy groups to identify patterns of abuse and connect victims with resources to fight back against suburban tyranny. The legal aid work taught me something valuable that any property owner can use. Most HOA bullies rely on intimidation rather than actual authority, like movie villains who look scary until someone turns on the lights. When challenged properly with documentation and federal law, their power evaporates faster than morning mist in mountain sunshine. We also started hosting quarterly Know Your Rights workshops at the community center, teaching property owners how to research federal land maps, verify HOA legal status, and recognize the warning signs of harassment disguised as community standards. The workshops always end with the same message. Never let bullies convince you that their authority is legitimate just because they have official-looking paperwork and voices loud enough to wake hibernating bears. A year later, our mountain community is stronger and more united than it's ever been. We look out for each other, help with snow removal and firewood cutting, and gather for potluck dinners, where the main topic of conversation is usually how beautiful the sunset looks over federal forest land that no HOA can ever control. Linda, meanwhile, is serving 18 months in federal prison and 5 years of probation, during which she's prohibited from holding any position in homeowner associations. Her story became a cautionary tale studied in legal schools as an example of how quickly suburban power trips can escalate into federal crimes. As for me, I'm still living peacefully in my hand-built cabin, watching sunsets with Ranger and helping other people fight back against neighborhood tyrants who think they're above the law. The mountain air still carries the scent of pine and possibility, and the only sound of authority I hear is the wind through federal forest trees. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, the view from the mountain is absolutely spectacular. Here's your call to action. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments below. You never know who might need to hear they're not alone in dealing with suburban bullies. And subscribe to HOA Stories for more tales about fighting corrupt systems and winning against impossible odds. Because everyone deserves to live peacefully on their own land.
That's a wrap for today's episode on HOA Stories. If you enjoyed watching Karma in action, smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and let us know if you've dealt with HOA madness too. Subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA meltdown we post.